Welcome to your storytelling. Enjoy the stories, and don't forget to subscribe. At first, it seemed harmless. Just a new hobby, something to pass the time. I watched as my husband, David, excitedly set up the VR headset, explaining how it would change everything. He swore it would be a fun escape, a way to unwind after a long day at work. I smiled, supportive, happy that he found something that sparked his interest again. After years of the same routine, a little excitement was a good thing. At first, the hours he spent with his headset were short, an hour here, 30 minutes there. He'd take off the headset, smile, and tell me about the virtual world he'd visited. He would joke about how realistic it felt, how immersive the environment was. "I feel like I'm really there," he'd say, eyes wide with enthusiasm. I couldn't help but laugh at his childlike excitement, but something in his tone changed after a while. There was a hint of something deeper, something that lingered in his voice after he removed the headset, as if he was reluctantly pulling away from another world that had begun to mean more to him than the one we shared. I didn't want to read too much into it. After all, it was still just a hobby. I noticed him staying up later, long after I'd fallen asleep, the glow of the VR screen lighting up the room. He would come to bed hours later than usual, slipping under the covers without a word. The first time it happened, I brushed it off. After all, we all get caught up in something new sometimes. But by the third night in a row, I started to feel the unease creeping in. The nights began to stretch longer, and David's routine shifted. It wasn't just the late hours anymore. It was the way he looked when he took off the headset. His eyes were distant, glazed over, like he'd been somewhere else entirely. I would wake up in the middle of the night, my fingers brushing against the empty space beside me. David wasn't there. I would find him in the living room, hunched over, absorbed in the virtual world. At first, I tried to ignore it. Maybe he just needed a break from work, a way to wind down. He had always been a workaholic, pouring himself into his career. A little time to himself wasn't the worst thing, I told myself. But when I glanced at the clock and saw the hours slip away, midnight, then 1, then 2, I began to feel a knot tightening in my stomach. He was disappearing into that glowing screen. I tried talking to him about it, but he would wave me off. "Just a little longer, babe. I'm on a roll." The excuse was always the same. But I started to feel like the little longer was becoming a permanent fixture in our life. There were no more quiet moments in bed, no more sharing of the little things. He seemed to exist in two worlds, one with me, one with this digital universe he was growing to love more than his own family. I made dinner one night, setting the table like I always did. I waited for him to come down, but he didn't. I found him, once again, in the darkened living room, headset firmly in place. "David," I called out, but he didn't respond. He never did anymore. That's when the real worry began. I couldn't ignore it anymore. David had become a shadow of the man I knew. The way he spoke had changed. The way he looked at me had changed. He'd always been so present, so in tune with our family. Now, when I tried to talk to him, he was absent, his mind somewhere far beyond our home. I asked him if everything was okay, and he just shrugged, muttering something about needing space. It wasn't just the hours of gameplay that worried me, it was how he acted afterward. He seemed distant. The small conversations we used to share over morning coffee felt like they were happening with a stranger. He didn't laugh like he used to, didn't care to listen to the kids' stories, didn't even acknowledge my attempts to connect. It wasn't that he was angry or upset. It was that he simply didn't seem to care. And then, one evening, it happened. He took off the headset, his face still illuminated by the blue light, and he looked at me with an eerie expression. "I was talking to someone," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. "I think she's real. I mean, I know she's not real, but I can feel her." My heart sank. Who was this someone? Who was he talking to? "David." I started, trying to make sense of his words, but he wasn't listening. He was already back in the virtual world, the AI characters now his real friends. I felt a cold shiver run through me. He was slipping away, and I didn't know how to stop it. The shift was undeniable. Family dinners, once the cornerstone of our routine, were no longer a priority. I would set the table, filling the space with the laughter of our kids, and wait. wait for David to show up. But more often than not, the chair across from me remained empty. He used to joke about his work hours, how sometimes it felt like he was living for the next meal with us. But now, when I called him down for dinner, he didn't even reply. It wasn't that he didn't want to be with us. It felt like he couldn't hear me at all, as if the world I was offering him wasn't enough. One evening, after the kids had long finished eating and the silence in the house was deafening, I found him sitting in the living room. The headset was on, his body still, his eyes fixed on the screen as though he couldn't tear himself away. I sat beside him, feeling the distance between us grow with every second. "David, please, come eat with us," I said softly, but he barely glanced in my direction. "Just a second, babe," he mumbled, his focus unwavering. I sat there for a moment, unsure what to say. I didn't know how to bring him back, how to make him see that the real world, the one with me and the kids, needed him more than any virtual world ever could. But I stayed silent. I didn't want to nag or make him feel guilty. But inside, I felt like something was slipping out of my grasp, something precious that I wasn't sure I could get back. I knew something was off when he started talking about his virtual friends more than he did about us. It wasn't just a passing comment anymore. It was as though the AI characters were more real to him than I was. At first, I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was a phase, something to occupy his mind. But the longer it went on, the more it gnawed at me. One night, after putting the kids to bed, I tried again. I sat next to him as he was finishing his game, headset still on, his fingers flying across the controls. I touched his arm gently, trying to get his attention. "David, can we talk?" He paused, but only for a second, before continuing to play. "Just a minute, babe. I'm almost finished here." But I needed him to look at me, to see that I was right in front of him. "David, what's going on? You're talking about these characters like they're real people. They're not real. We're real." He turned to me, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the screen. There was a slight frown on his brow, as though he didn't quite understand what I was saying. "They understand me, Emily. They listen. They don't judge." His voice was soft, almost wistful. "You don't get it." My heart sank as the weight of his words hit me. He was right. I didn't get it. How could I? How could anyone? A world of code and algorithms couldn't possibly replace the love, the warmth, the reality of family. Yet, there he was, choosing it over us. And in that moment, I realized how deep his connection had grown to this digital world. I stood up, my voice trembling. "You're losing yourself, David. And I'm losing you." But he didn't hear me. His mind was already miles away, back in that other world with his friends. Dinner became a ritual I performed alone. I'd prepare the meal, setting out plates and silverware for each of us, but David's seat was almost always empty. The kids noticed it too. At first, they asked where Daddy was, but as the days turned into weeks, they stopped asking. They had started to accept that his absence was a part of our routine. I tried to make the best of it. I told myself it was temporary, that he'd snap out of it. But as I sat across from our children, the laughter that used to fill the table felt hollow. The stories they shared, about school, friends, their day, felt incomplete without David's voice to add to the conversation. It wasn't just that he wasn't there physically. It was the emotional distance that was growing between us, like a vast chasm I wasn't sure how to bridge. One evening, the kids and I finished dinner, as we usually did, with quiet chatter as they worked on their homework. The house felt still, too still, like something was missing. I stood up to clear the table when I heard the faint hum of the headset from the living room. I walked in, finding him exactly where I knew he'd be, eyes hidden behind the VR headset, his fingers moving in rhythm to whatever game he was immersed in. The world around him didn't exist. It was just him, the glowing screen, and his AI companions. "David," I said, trying to sound casual, though my heart was heavy. "You're not even going to join us for dinner?" He glanced at me briefly, then back at the screen. "I'm busy, Emily. I'm almost at a new level. Just give me a little more time." His words felt like a slap. A little more time. That's all he had for me now. Just a little more time before he retreated into his new world. And that little more time was becoming less and less. I walked back to the kitchen, my stomach twisting. The kids were getting used to his absence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was no longer just a hobby. It was an escape, a way for him to avoid the life we built together. And the longer he spent there, the further he drifted away from us. Our son's birthday should have been a day filled with excitement, laughter, and love. Instead, it felt like any other day. I spent hours planning his surprise, decorating the house with balloons, and preparing his favorite meal. He was so excited, his eyes sparkling as he waited for David to come home and celebrate with him. But when the time came, David wasn't there. He was, of course, in the living room, headset firmly in place, as though nothing else mattered. The cake sat untouched, the balloons swaying in the breeze as the silence grew louder. "Daddy's going to come, right?" our son asked, his voice trembling with uncertainty. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't lie to him. So, I just smiled and nodded, but inside, I was breaking. I had hoped, prayed, that maybe tonight would be different. Maybe tonight, David would remember what mattered. But he didn't. As the hours passed, I tried calling him several times, but he didn't pick up. When I finally confronted him later that night, his response was almost casual. "I'm sorry, Emily. I lost track of time. I didn't mean to forget." But it wasn't just forgetting. It was more than that. It was a choice. A choice to ignore us, to prioritize a virtual world over his own family. And when I looked at our son's disappointed face, I realized that this wasn't just a hobby anymore. It was an addiction, one that was slowly taking over the life we once had. The reality of what was happening settled over me like a heavy blanket I couldn't shake off. It wasn't just the late nights or the missed dinners. It was the fact that David seemed more comfortable in the virtual world than in the one we shared. He no longer looked at me with the same warmth. Our conversations had become one-sided, with him offering little more than distracted nods or vague responses. He would say uh-huh or sure as I spoke, his attention split between me and whatever character he was interacting with in his headset. Even when I told him about my day, about the kids' accomplishments, about little things that mattered, he seemed uninterested. I didn't recognize the man sitting across from me anymore. It wasn't just that he was physically absent, he was emotionally absent too. There was no warmth in his eyes, no smile, no laughter. And it wasn't because he didn't care. I could see that he was deeply involved in his virtual world, but the deeper he went, the further he distanced himself from the people who loved him. I began to ask myself, was I no longer enough for him? Was our family no longer enough? One evening, I stood by the doorway of the living room, watching as he laughed and joked with the AI characters. His laughter sounded strange, forced, yet real in its own way. I called his name softly. "David." He didn't even flinch. It was as though I wasn't even there. I walked into the room, trying to pull his attention away from the screen. I gently placed my hand on his shoulder. "David, please, can we talk?" He paused the game for a moment, and then slowly took off his headset. "What's up?" he asked, his voice flat. I looked into his eyes, but all I saw was emptiness. "I miss you," I whispered, almost pleading. "I miss us." For a moment, he looked at me, as though considering my words. Then, with a shrug, he said, "I'm still here, Emily. I'm just doing something important." But it wasn't important. At least, not to me. The truth was, I was no longer a part of his world, not in the way I used to be. And I realized then that if something didn't change soon, I might lose him entirely. The tension had been building for weeks, but I never thought it would come to this, a full-blown argument. I couldn't hold it in any longer. I had tried to keep it together for the sake of our family, for the sake of the kids, but the distance between us was unbearable. One night, after another long day, I found him in the living room again. This time, the kids were already in bed, and I could feel the exhaustion settling into my bones. But what hurt the most wasn't the fatigue. It was the absence of his presence in our home. "David, we need to talk," I said, my voice shaking slightly. He didn't look at me at first. "Can it wait?" "I'm in the middle of something," he said dismissively. "No, it can't," I shot back, my frustration boiling over. "You can't keep doing this. You're losing us. You're losing me." He looked at me then, and his expression was filled with confusion. "What do you mean? I'm right here." "No, you're not." I raised my voice, startling both of us. You're physically here, but you're not here. You're with them. The characters. The AI. They're your friends now, and I'm just someone who's getting in the way. He stood up, throwing his hands in the air. You don't get it, Emily. They understand me. They don't judge me. They don't nag me about my job or my responsibilities. My heart sank at his words. It was like a slap in the face. I don't nag you, David. I care about you. I care about us. But you've stopped caring. You're too busy living in a world that isn't real to even notice your own family. His face hardened. Maybe the real world isn't enough for me anymore. His words hit me like a freight train. A cold, sharp realization that what I feared most was already happening. He was choosing the virtual world over the real one, and I was powerless to stop it. Maybe I'm not enough for you, I whispered, my voice cracking. Maybe we aren't enough. The silence between us was suffocating. Neither of us knew what to say next. The days after the argument were quieter, but the tension between us was thick, palpable. David still played his VR games late into the night, his responses to me becoming more and more distant. I began to wonder if things could ever go back to normal. One evening, as I walked into the living room, I found David speaking to one of the AI characters in the game. He was animated, his voice filled with affection and excitement, and for a brief moment, I felt like an intruder in my own home. Did you hear that? David asked the AI, laughing. You're always so funny. I can't believe they programmed you with that level of humor. I paused in the doorway, my heart sinking. Who are you talking to? I asked, though I already knew the answer. David didn't even seem to register my question at first. He was too absorbed in the game, too wrapped up in the world where his new friends lived. Oh, sorry, Emily, he said absent-mindedly, as though he were pulled back to reality for a second. I'm talking to Sarah. She's one of the NPCs in the game. I blinked in confusion. Sarah? I repeated, my voice tight. You've named her? He glanced at me, a sheepish smile on his face. Yeah, she's got this great personality, you know? I feel like she gets me. It hit me like a punch to the gut. He had given the AI a name, a personality, as if she were more real to him than I was. I had become nothing more than a background noise in his life, while Sarah had become his confidant, his companion. The ache in my chest deepened, but I said nothing. How could I compete with a virtual world that understood him better than I did? Days turned into weeks, and I watched as David's obsession with the virtual world deepened. It wasn't just a hobby anymore. It had become his reality. I began to feel like I was living in a parallel universe, one where David wasn't really there, where the love we once shared had faded into something I could no longer recognize. It became harder to breathe in this house. I found myself alone, surrounded by reminders of a life that once felt complete, now hollowed out by a digital presence. He would come home from work, but instead of greeting me or the kids, he would retreat to the living room, donning the headset and disappearing once again. I tried to fill the silence. I threw myself into my work, into the kids, into anything that could distract me from the growing emptiness inside me. But no matter how busy I got, I couldn't escape the growing void between us. One evening, after another lonely dinner, I sat in our bedroom, staring at the empty side of the bed. The silence felt suffocating. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. I couldn't keep waiting for David to return to the man I once knew. I stood up and walked into the living room. This time, I was determined. David, I said, my voice steady. We need to talk. He looked up from the screen, his eyes slightly glazed, as though he hadn't quite snapped back to reality yet. Not now, Emily. I'm in the middle of something. No, I said, cutting him off. You're not in the middle of something. You're escaping. You've been escaping from me, from us, and I can't keep living like this. He removed the headset slowly, his expression distant. I'm not escaping, Emily. This is just a way for me to unwind. A way to relax. I shook my head. This isn't relaxation, David. It's an addiction. And it's tearing our family apart. He looked at me, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. You just don't understand. This is where I feel alive. The real world it's overwhelming. I need this, But at what cost? I asked, my voice trembling. What about us, David? What about our family? What about me? I need you here. Not in some digital world with your fake friends. He stood up then, his eyes narrowing. You're just jealous, Emily. You're angry because I've found something that makes me happy. I stared at him, my heart breaking. This isn't happiness, David. This is a lie. And I'm not going to keep living it. It wasn't just me who was noticing the distance between us. The kids, too, began to sense the change. At first, they didn't fully understand why Daddy wasn't around as much, or why he seemed so distant when he was home. But as time went on, they started to ask questions. Simple ones, at first. Where's Daddy? Our daughter asked one night as she sat at the kitchen table, coloring. Why is he always in the living room with that thing on his head? I tried to explain in a way they could understand, but the truth was too complicated for their young minds. I just smiled weakly and said, he's just busy, sweetie. He's playing a game. But as the days passed, their questions became harder to ignore. Why doesn't Daddy want to play with us anymore? Our son asked one evening, his small face scrunched in confusion. I felt the ache in my chest grow. He's just tired, baby. He's working a lot, I said, though the words felt hollow coming from my mouth. I hated lying to them. I hated that they had to grow up with the absence of a father who was physically present, but emotionally gone. I saw the way they looked at David when he would finally emerge from his VR world, his face blank and distant, as if he were a stranger to them, and it broke my heart each time. That evening, as I tucked them into bed, my son reached out and hugged me tightly. I miss Daddy, he whispered. I miss him too, sweetheart. I whispered back, my voice cracking. I miss him too. I had spent months trying to understand David's obsession with the virtual world. I tried to support him, to give him space, to hope that it was just a phase. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just a phase. This wasn't something that would pass. One evening, as I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, I saw him again. His headset was on, his eyes lost in the digital world. The kids were asleep, and for the first time in a long time, I was truly alone with him. I walked in quietly, sitting on the edge of the bed. David, I said softly, it's time to face the truth. He didn't respond, lost in the virtual space. But I couldn't wait any longer. I reached over and gently pulled the headset off his head. David, I said, my voice trembling with emotion, you're killing us. You're killing our family, and I can't keep watching you do this. He stared at me, his expression unreadable. I'm not killing anyone, Emily. I just need to be happy. I need something for myself. I shook my head, tears welling up in my eyes. This isn't happiness, David. This is a prison. You've locked yourself away in this world, and you're abandoning the people who love you. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, his face hollow. And in that moment, I realized he was too far gone. The man I had loved, the father of our children, had disappeared into a digital void. I stood up slowly, my heart breaking. I can't do this anymore. I deserve more than this. And with that, I walked out of the room, leaving him behind in his artificial world. The weeks that followed were full of uncertainty. I spent more time with the kids, trying to shield them from the growing tension between David and me. I tried to remain strong for them, to show them that we would be okay, even if things were falling apart at home. But David didn't change. He didn't try to reach out, didn't apologize, didn't make any effort to rebuild what we once had. He remained in his world, lost in a place where he didn't have to confront his problems. And in the silence, the weight of his choice became clearer every day. One day, I came home to find a letter from David on the kitchen table. My hands shook as I opened it, my heart pounding. The letter was brief, but the words were like a knife to the heart. I need time, Emily. I need time to figure things out. I can't be the person you want me to be right now. And just like that, I realized he had made his choice. He had chosen the virtual world over everything we had built. Over me, over our children, over the love we once shared. I folded the letter carefully, placing it back on the table. And as I looked at the empty space where he used to be, I knew that this time, there was no going back. The man I loved was gone, and in his place, only the virtual world remained. The silence at home was deafening. I had been preparing for this moment, bracing myself for the inevitable, but nothing could prepare me for the hollow feeling that came after David's letter. It wasn't just the absence of his presence. It was the emotional weight of knowing that he had chosen to leave us behind, even if only in spirit. I threw myself into the routine of daily life, trying to keep things as normal as possible for the kids. I took them to school, helped with homework, and made dinner, just like I had before. But something was missing. Something was always missing. Every night, I put the kids to bed and then sit in the living room, staring at the empty space where David used to sit. The house felt cold, despite the warmth of the lamps. The silence hung heavy, and it was only broken by the occasional sound of David's VR headset humming in the other room. I hadn't heard him speak to me in days. He was still there, physically, but mentally he was miles away. I felt like I was living with a ghost. He wasn't the man I married. He wasn't the father he used to be, and I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. One night, as I stood by the door, watching him interact with his virtual companions on the screen, I realized that I had been waiting for him to choose us for far too long. It wasn't going to happen. He was lost in that world, and I had to face the painful truth. If I wanted to protect my family and find peace, I had to let go. I couldn't keep living in this limbo. The following days passed in a blur. I tried to have conversations with David, but they always ended in frustration. Every attempt to connect with him seemed to be met with resistance. One evening, I walked into the living room, where he was once again lost in the virtual world. I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I needed to say something, to make him realize what he was losing. I stood in front of him, hands clenched at my sides, and waited for him to notice me. He didn't. "David," I said, my voice soft at first. "David, we need to talk." He didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the screen, his fingers tapping away at the controls. "David," I said louder this time. His headset was still on, and he didn't even flinch. My frustration boiled over. I reached out and pulled the headset off his head, forcing him to face me. "What are you doing, Emily?" he asked, his voice cold, his eyes narrowing in irritation. "I'm busy. I told you I need this." "No," I said, my voice breaking with emotion. "You need us. You're losing us, David. And you don't even seem to care." He stood up abruptly, his expression hardening. "This is just a game, Emily. You're overreacting." "A game? A game?" I repeated, my voice trembling. "This is more than a game, David. You've let it consume you. And now, it's consuming our family." He shook his head, exasperated. "You don't get it, Emily. This is where I feel free. This is the only place that makes sense to me right now." I felt a lump form in my throat, but I pushed it down. "Well, it doesn't make sense to me. And it doesn't make sense to the kids. You're choosing this world over us, over everything we've built." He looked at me for a long moment, and for the briefest second, I saw something, regret, perhaps, or confusion, in his eyes. But it was fleeting. "I can't do this right now," he said, turning away from me. "I need space." And just like that, the conversation I had hoped for, the one where he would open his eyes and see what he was losing, never happened. He retreated back into his digital world, leaving me standing there, alone. I woke up one morning to the familiar weight of emptiness in the house. David was still gone, emotionally, and I was left to pick up the pieces. I had tried to be patient. I had tried to make him see the damage he was doing. But it was clear to me now. He wasn't going to change. The reality of the situation set in with crushing force. I had spent so much time hoping for something that would never happen, and in doing so, I had lost pieces of myself. I had sacrificed my happiness, my peace, and my family's well-being, waiting for David to return, but waiting was no longer an option. It was time for me to make a decision. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep pretending that things would magically get better. The kids deserved more than a half-empty house, and I deserved more than a half-hearted marriage. I made the decision then. I was going to leave. Not because I didn't love David, but because I loved myself enough to walk away from a relationship that had already died. I spent the next few days preparing, packing, and making arrangements. I kept the details to myself, not wanting to hurt the kids more than I had to. When the day came, I took one last look at the life we had built, and I knew in my heart that it was time to move on. The day I left was quiet. Too quiet. I had packed our things, made sure the kids had what they needed, and told them we were going on a short trip. I didn't know how to explain to them what was happening, or why Daddy wasn't coming with us. I walked into the living room, where David was once again absorbed in his virtual world. He didn't even notice me. I stood there for a moment, watching him, and then I took a deep breath. "David," I said softly. He removed the headset, looking at me blankly. "What's going on, Emily?" "I'm leaving," I said quietly, my heart aching. "We're leaving." He blinked in confusion. "What do you mean, leaving?" "I mean that I can't do this anymore, David," I said, my voice trembling with emotion. "I can't keep waiting for you to come back. You've already left, and it's time for me to move on." He didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at me. "I hope one day you'll realize what you've lost," I whispered, tears filling my eyes. And then, without another word, I turned and walked out of the door, leaving behind the life we once had. As I left the house, the weight of the decision pressed down on me like a heavy stone. The kids were in the back seat, quietly playing with their toys, unaware of the shift that had just occurred. I kept my gaze focused on the road ahead, not daring to look back. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. Walking away from David was not something I had ever imagined doing when we first got married. But there I was, driving away from the life I thought I would have forever. I couldn't help but wonder if this was what it felt like to break free, to take control of your own happiness after so many years of feeling lost. The drive was long, but I didn't mind the silence. It gave me time to think, to process what had just happened, to reflect on all the years I had spent trying to keep things together, trying to hold on to a marriage that had already slipped away. I kept telling myself that I did the right thing. I had to leave. For me. For the kids. When we arrived at my sister's house, I was exhausted. Mentally, emotionally, physically. But I had made it through. I had made it out. The kids jumped out of the car, eager to see their cousins, and I allowed myself a moment to breathe. I was finally free. The first few days after I left were a blur. My sister had opened her home to us, and the kids settled in as though nothing had changed. They were resilient, just like their father, but I could see the subtle signs of confusion and sadness in their eyes. And me? I felt numb. I felt relief and heartbreak all at once. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought of David. I thought of what could have been, of the man I used to love, and of the life we once shared. I had to remind myself that this was for the best, but it didn't make it any easier. I spent hours scrolling through old pictures of us, memories of our time together, vacations, holidays, even just quiet evenings at home. It felt like a lifetime ago. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It was him, the real David, the one who used to laugh and joke with me, who once made me feel loved and wanted. I cried more than I thought I would. And yet, I never regretted leaving. Not for a second. Days turned into weeks, and David still hadn't contacted me. He had completely withdrawn. No texts, no calls, no attempts to reach out. I had hoped that maybe he'd come around, that he'd realize what was at stake. But as the days passed, it became clear that he was lost in his virtual world, completely absorbed in the escape that had taken him from us. I didn't know what to feel anymore. Anger? Sadness? Sympathy? Part of me wanted to reach out, to try and pull him back from that world, but I knew I couldn't do it anymore. I had given him every chance. I had begged him to come back to reality, to be present, to fight for us. But he had chosen the digital world instead. And now, I had to choose myself. I decided it was time for the next step. I called a lawyer. I couldn't keep living in limbo, waiting for a man who wasn't there. After I filed for separation, something shifted in me. It was like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I still missed David. I still loved him in some strange, distant way, but I knew that this was the right decision for me, for the kids, for all of us. I threw myself into work, focusing on building a life without him, without the looming presence of his absence. I started seeing a therapist to help me process the emotional toll of the last few years. I talked about the heartbreak, the feeling of being invisible, the way David had disappeared into his virtual world. It was hard, but with each session, I began to feel stronger. I began to feel like myself again, like the woman I had been before I met David. I could still remember the woman who had dreams and hopes outside of a marriage that had slowly started to drain her. And now, I was rebuilding. One night, months after I had left, I was sitting at my kitchen table, working on some paperwork for the kids' school. My phone buzzed with a notification, a message from David. I stared at the screen, my heart racing. It had been so long since I had heard from him. The message was simple. I've been thinking a lot. I'm sorry, Emily. I was lost. I was wrong. I read it over and over, trying to make sense of it. I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he was finally waking up. Maybe he wanted to fight for us after all. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Could I forgive him? Could I trust him again? I didn't know the answer, but I knew I wasn't ready to answer him just yet. A week later, David showed up at my sister's house. He was standing in the doorway, holding a bouquet of flowers, looking uncertain. The moment our eyes met, everything came rushing back. The love, the pain, the years of silence. I never meant for it to go this far, he said quietly, his voice trembling. I've lost so much, Emily. I lost you. I lost the kids. And I can't undo the past, but I want to try. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. The David I had known was standing there, but I also knew that nothing would ever be the same. The journey we had been on together had changed me in ways I couldn't fully explain. I don't know, David, I said, my voice shaking. I don't know if I can trust you again. I don't know if we can ever go back to what we were. I'm not asking you to, he said, his voice full of regret. I'm asking you for a chance to rebuild, a chance to be better, to be present, not just in your life, but in the kids' lives too. I looked at him, torn between the man I once loved and the man he had become. Could I give him that chance? Could I risk it all again? The answer wasn't clear yet, but for the first time in a long time, I felt the flicker of possibility. Maybe, just maybe, there could be a future for us again. But it was going to take time, and trust, and change. David's return didn't mean everything was fixed. It didn't mean we suddenly picked up where we had left off. But it was a beginning, a new start. We took things slowly. David enrolled in therapy, and we started attending counseling together. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, moments when I questioned if we were doing the right thing. But with each passing day, I saw him try harder, really try to be present, to be the father and husband I had once known. It wasn't perfect, but I had learned that healing wasn't a straight line. It was a process, a messy, sometimes painful process, but a process nonetheless. And as I looked at David, I realized that maybe, just maybe, we could rebuild. It wouldn't be the same as before, but we could start fresh together. It wasn't easy, trying to move forward with David. Despite his promises and the work he was putting into the relationship, I couldn't help but feel guarded. There were moments when I'd see a flicker of the man he used to be, the one I fell in love with, and I'd allow myself to feel hope. But then, other times, I'd see the shadows of his past behavior creeping back in. The same distance, the same withdrawal when things got tough. Therapy helped, but it was only part of the equation. We still had to live out the changes. Every day felt like a test. There were times I'd question whether it was worth it. Could we truly rebuild what had been broken? Could we heal enough to create a future together? Or were we simply chasing a ghost of what once was? I had to be honest with myself. The emotional scars from the years of neglect wouldn't just vanish. There were still moments when I'd catch myself pulling away, afraid to fully trust again. But we kept trying. I kept trying. David tried, too. And as much as it pained me, I realized I couldn't live in a state of constant fear. I had to let go of the past, even if it still hurt. And so, we moved forward, tentatively, step by step. The kids, too, were adjusting. They had questions. So many questions. They were trying to understand why things had changed so suddenly, why their father was no longer the same. I had to be careful with how I answered them. I didn't want them to hate him, but I also couldn't lie to them. So, we told them the truth in ways they could understand. That Daddy had been going through a hard time, and that we were all working together to help him get better. It wasn't easy, especially when they would ask why he couldn't just play with them like he used to, why he had been gone so long, emotionally, when he was physically present. But I was determined to make sure they didn't feel abandoned. I showered them with love and affection, reminding them that no matter what, they were my priority. And slowly, as the weeks turned into months, they began to warm up to their father again. The distance between them started to close, but it wasn't perfect. The scars on their hearts were just as real as mine. We all had to heal, and that was something I was starting to accept. That healing wasn't a quick fix. It was something we all needed, in different ways, and it was going to take time. As the days passed, we started to find a new routine. It wasn't the life we once had, but it was something new, something different. David started spending more time with the kids, taking them to the park, playing board games at night, and helping with their homework. It wasn't much, but it was more than he had done in the past. I watched the way the kids responded to him, the way they warmed up to him slowly, like they were testing the waters. They were cautious, too, unsure whether to trust him fully, but they were willing to try, and that meant something. At night, after the kids had gone to bed, David and I would sit together on the couch. We'd talk, sometimes about nothing, other times about the past. He would apologize again and again for the pain he had caused, and I would listen, my heart heavy, but open. It wasn't forgiveness I was offering, not yet, but I was willing to try. We were rebuilding, piece by piece. It was slow, but it was something. Trust was the hardest thing to rebuild. Every time David would slip, even if it was just a small thing, I'd feel that familiar ache in my chest, that fear, that doubt, that maybe it was all just a facade. It wasn't easy to fight against those feelings. After everything we had been through, it felt impossible to let go of the fear that one day he would disappear again, this time for good. But I knew that if we were going to move forward, I had to allow myself the space to trust him again. We started taking small steps, David making dinner, coming home early from work, and being present in the moment. It was a slow, awkward process at first. There were moments when we'd stare at each other in silence, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to bridge the gap between us. But we didn't give up. Not this time. I could feel the changes, even if they were small. The way David would look at me now, with a softness that wasn't there before. The way he would hold my hand when we went to bed, as if he was trying to prove he was there. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close. But it was real. And sometimes that was all we could ask for. Months had passed since I left, since I took the brave step of leaving a life that was slowly suffocating me. And now, standing here with David by my side, I was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could create something new. Our future didn't have to look like the past. It didn't have to be perfect, but it could be ours, together. The healing wasn't over. It probably never would be. There would always be scars, reminders of what we had been through. But we were still here, and that meant something. David had started to work on himself, not for me, not for the kids, but for himself. And that made all the difference. I could see the man he was becoming. The man I had always known was underneath all the pain and addiction. He was working hard to prove that he was worth the second chance he had been given. And I was learning to let go of the past, to forgive, and to trust again. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. The road ahead was long, but I was willing to walk it. And maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. But this time, we would build it right, together. As time went on, things began to feel normal, but not in the way they had before. This wasn't the same life we had once known. It was different, more fragile, yet strangely more resilient. We were learning how to exist together in this new reality, where the old expectations didn't apply, but where hope and love still had a place. The kids were starting to understand what was happening. They had seen their father struggle, watched him fight to be a better person. And even though there were still moments of uncertainty, there were more moments of connection. I could see it in the way they would run to him when he got home from work, the way they would ask him to play with them, and how he was starting to feel more at ease with them, too. It wasn't the fairy tale reunion I'd once imagined, but it was something more genuine. We were finding our way back to each other, slowly and carefully. David was changing. It wasn't easy for him, and I could see the struggle in his eyes when old habits tried to resurface. but he was working on it. We both were. I started taking small steps toward rebuilding my own life, too. I had been so focused on David's recovery and the kids that I hadn't given myself permission to think about what I needed. I'd started taking yoga classes, reconnecting with old friends, and even going out for coffee alone. I hadn't realized how much I'd lost myself in the process of trying to save my marriage. But now, I was learning to take care of myself again. And that, too, was part of the healing process. Even as we found a new rhythm in our lives, there were questions that lingered. Sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet, I would wonder if we had made the right choice. Was this truly the beginning of something new? Or was it just a temporary fix? I would look at David, lying next to me, his breath steady and calm, and I would wonder, what if he relapses? What if one day, this all unravels again? The fear still lingered, haunting me at times when I was least prepared for it. I knew that I couldn't live in constant fear, but it was hard to shake the uncertainty. David would often sense my unease, even without me saying anything. He'd reach out in the dark, his hand finding mine. "I know you're scared," he'd say quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "But I swear to you, I'm doing the work. I'm not going back." And I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust him completely. But sometimes, trust is like a fragile thing, something you have to build brick by brick, and I still wasn't sure if I could fully give him all of mine again. The questions, the doubts, they didn't go away. But with each passing day, I realized they didn't have to rule my life either. One evening, after dinner, we sat down together to talk. It wasn't the usual light conversation or discussions about bills and school schedules. It was a deep, heart-to-heart talk, something we hadn't had in a long time. "I've been thinking a lot," David started, his voice low. "I know you're still unsure about us, and I get that, but I need you to know something." I looked at him, my heart beating a little faster. "What?" He took a deep breath, his eyes not leaving mine. "I can't undo the past. I can't take back the years I lost, the way I hurt you. But what I can do is keep fighting. Every day, for the rest of my life, I'll keep fighting for you, for the kids, and for us. I'm not going to give up. Not this time. Not ever." I felt a lump form in my throat. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust that he meant every word. But part of me was still holding back, still afraid that he'd say one thing and do another. "I know it's hard," he continued, his voice softer now, "but I'm asking you to take one more step with me. I'm not asking for everything to be perfect. I'm just asking for a chance to prove that I'm worth it, that we can be worth it." For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel just fear. I felt something else too, a small spark of hope, and maybe that was all I needed. "I'll try," I said quietly. "I'll try to trust you again." As the weeks passed, we both worked hard to honor our commitment to each other. For David, it meant continuing therapy and being accountable for his actions, no matter how small. For me, it meant learning how to trust him again, little by little. There were still moments of doubt, moments when I would question whether I had made the right decision. But there were also small victories. David would do things I hadn't expected, helping with the kids' homework without me asking, planning family outings, and even making dinner on nights when I was feeling overwhelmed. And slowly, I began to see the man I had fallen in love with, just a little different, but still the same at the core. He was trying. And for the first time in a long time, so was I. It wasn't easy, but it was real. And sometimes that was enough. Months had passed since I left, and now, standing here with David and the kids, I realized something important. Healing wasn't linear. There were days when everything felt like it was falling apart, and there were days when it felt like we were on the brink of something beautiful. We weren't perfect, and we weren't fixed, but we were moving forward. Together. I didn't know what the future held. Maybe we would have more struggles ahead. But I also knew that we had the strength to face whatever came our way. As I looked at David, smiling at the kids and laughing as they played, I couldn't help but feel a quiet peace settle within me. We had come a long way. And maybe, just maybe, we were starting to build something stronger than what we had before. The past was never far behind us, but it didn't have to define us. We were ready for whatever came next. Just when things seemed to be settling into a new rhythm, life threw us another curveball. It wasn't anything huge, but it was enough to stir up old fears. David's job, which had been a steady anchor, started to demand more of his time. Late nights at the office, weekend projects, calls that stretched into the evening. It felt eerily similar to the days when he had withdrawn into his virtual world. Only now, the distraction was work. I tried to stay calm, to remind myself that we had learned how to communicate better, that we had come so far from where we had been. But old habits die hard, and I could feel that creeping anxiety returning. Was this the beginning of another slow drift? Was he slipping away again? One night, after the kids had gone to bed, I confronted him. "David, what's going on? I've barely seen you this week. You're not even here when you were here. What's happening?" He looked at me, exhaustion written all over his face. "I'm just trying to keep up, Emily. There's a lot of pressure at work right now, and I don't know how to juggle it all." I could hear the frustration in his voice, but there was something else there too, guilt. The same guilt I had heard before, when he realized how much he had neglected us in the past. "I get that," I said, my voice steady despite the rising worry in my chest. "But I need you to be here, with us. Not just physically, but emotionally too. We've come so far, David. Don't let work pull you back into that same place." He sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not going anywhere, Emily. I promise you, I'm trying. I'm still learning how to balance everything." I nodded, understanding but still unsure. It was a test, one I didn't expect so soon. Would he choose to fight through it? Or would I be left holding the pieces again? The following weeks were a mix of progress and setbacks. David made an effort to cut back on work when he could, but there were still late nights, still moments when he would withdraw into his thoughts. I had to remind myself not to jump to conclusions, not to let my fears rule the moment. I spent more time with the kids, trying to fill the spaces that David couldn't. We went on little outings, made new memories, and I focused on enjoying the time we had, even if it wasn't always what I had imagined. In my own heart, I worked on letting go of the need to control everything, to constantly worry about the worst-case scenario. I realized that the only way we could continue to move forward was if I trusted David, not just with my heart, but with his own. One night, after a particularly difficult day, I found David sitting at the kitchen table, looking lost in thought. I joined him, sitting quietly at his side for a while, not forcing words between us. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to mess this up again, Emily. I don't want to lose you." I reached over and took his hand. "I know you don't, and I'm here. But I need you to be here too, not just for me, but for us. We can't do this on our own." He nodded, squeezing my hand, his eyes full of emotion. "I'm trying. I really am. I'll keep trying." And in that moment, I knew that we weren't perfect. But maybe, just maybe, we were learning how to live with our imperfections and still choose each other every day. As the months passed, the intensity of the previous months started to fade. There were still hard days, still moments of doubt, but there was something different now. A sense of peace had settled into our home. It wasn't a peace born of perfection, but of resilience. David continued to work on his balance, attending therapy regularly and spending more time with us. The kids were thriving, and we were learning how to communicate better. Our evenings, though never the same as before, had become something we looked forward to. Family dinners, game nights, and simple talks on the couch felt like small miracles. We had built something new, something that was uniquely ours. It wasn't what I had imagined when we first got married, but it was real, and that was enough. David and I still had our moments of doubt, still wrestled with the scars of the past, but we were no longer bound by them. We were free to grow, to change, and to shape our own future. Together. One evening, as we all sat around the table, the kids laughing and David telling one of his silly stories, I realized that we had come full circle, not to the life we once had, but to a new beginning, one that was still in the making. And maybe, just maybe, that was more than I had ever hoped for. The journey to this point had been long, painful, and full of twists I hadn't expected. But when I looked back on it all, I realized that it was a journey that had taught me more than I could have ever imagined. I had learned the importance of self-worth, of knowing when to fight and when to let go. I had learned the value of vulnerability, of being honest with myself and with those I loved. And, most importantly, I had learned that love wasn't just about the grand gestures or perfect moments. It was about showing up, day after day, even when things were hard. David had learned his own lessons, about addiction, about the dangers of escaping into something that wasn't real, and about the importance of being present in the lives of those who mattered most. We both learned that healing wasn't linear, and that it wasn't something that could be forced. It came in its own time, in its own way. As I sat in the quiet of our home, watching my family, I realized that we had done it. We had made it through the darkest days and come out stronger on the other side. Not perfect, not without scars, but stronger and more whole than we had ever been before. And maybe that was the true beauty of it all, the fact that we had survived. Together. There was still much to come, many more lessons to be learned, but for the first time in a long time, I was no longer afraid of the future. I had learned to trust again, to believe in the possibility of change. We weren't finished healing, but we were on the right path. And with each new day, I knew that we could face whatever came next, together. The road ahead was uncertain, yes, but it was ours. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. As the years went by, our life together continued to evolve. We had grown so much, and with that growth came the ability to find joy in even the small things. David and I started a new tradition, a Sunday morning ritual where we would wake up early, have breakfast together, and spend the day doing something simple, just the two of us, or as a family. It was our time to reconnect, to check in with one another without the distractions of work or daily responsibilities. At first, it felt awkward. It wasn't the easy, effortless bonding we used to have, but it was a start, and that was enough. Over time, those mornings became something I looked forward to. It was during these quiet moments that we would talk about everything, the past, the present, the future. We would share our dreams, our worries, and our hopes for the kids. There were no barriers between us anymore. For the first time in years, we had found a new rhythm, one that was based on understanding, compromise, and the commitment to never take each other for granted again. It was these simple moments that slowly stitched our hearts back together, day by day. Watching the kids grow was a bittersweet experience. They were getting older, and I could see the subtle changes in their personalities. It wasn't just about what they learned at school or how they developed friendships. It was also about how they were absorbing everything we went through. There were moments when they would ask questions about the past, about why things had been so different back then. They were curious, wanting to understand the complexities of our family's journey. I could see the concern in their eyes, as if they were still processing what had happened, even though it was so far behind us. I remember when Dad was always busy, my youngest Lily said one evening as we sat around the dinner table, but now he's here more. I like it when he's here. David smiled softly, his gaze full of warmth. I like being here with you too, sweetie. I watched them both, feeling a mix of pride and sorrow. The kids had seen the darkness, and they had witnessed the healing. They were learning that families weren't perfect, that we all had our struggles. But they were also learning that love and commitment could heal even the deepest wounds. And that was something beautiful. The more time passed, the more I realized that the future was not something to fear. It was something to embrace, together. With every challenge we faced, every moment of doubt we overcame, I knew that we were stronger than we had ever been before. David's work-life balance had improved, and he was more present now than ever. But beyond that, he had also become more in tune with his own needs, his own mental health. He wasn't just existing anymore. He was living. I could see it in his eyes. There was a clarity that hadn't been there before. The addiction to virtual reality was no longer a shadow looming over us. Instead, it had become part of our story, a chapter that had been difficult, yes, but one that had led us to a better place. We were a family, rebuilt, but no longer broken. We had come to understand that it wasn't perfection we were after, it was progress. And as long as we kept moving forward, kept trying, we were on the right path. Together, we faced the unknown future with courage, ready to take on whatever came our way. The road might be long, but we knew now that we didn't have to walk it alone. One evening, as we sat around the dinner table, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The house was filled with the sounds of laughter, the warmth of family, and the simple joy of being together. I glanced at David across the table. He caught my eye and smiled, his expression a mix of contentment and recognition that we had come through so much and had emerged stronger. We had weathered the storms, faced the pain, and emerged with something better than we could have ever expected. I raised my glass, looking around at the faces I loved most in this world. To family, I said softly, to love, and to never taking each other for granted again. David raised his glass, echoing my sentiment. To us. The kids giggled, toasting in their own way. It wasn't just a toast to a dinner, to a moment. It was a toast to our future. A future we would continue to build, one day at a time. As the years rolled by, the lessons we had learned stayed with us, becoming the foundation for everything we did. Our marriage, though not perfect, was stronger than it had ever been. David's growth wasn't just something he did for me or the kids, it was for himself. And that, I realized, was the key. We had both learned that we couldn't change each other. We could only change ourselves, and in doing so, we could build something lasting. The kids were growing up, blossoming into their own people, each of them carrying their own understanding of what love, family, and resilience meant. They had seen their parents struggle, but they had also seen us fight, rebuild, and thrive. And that was a gift I would always cherish, the gift of showing them what it meant to keep going, no matter how hard life got. As for David and me, we didn't have all the answers, and we never would. But we had each other. And in a world full of uncertainty, that was the greatest gift of all. We had learned to live, to love, and most importantly, to keep growing. Looking ahead, there were still many unknowns. There would always be moments of doubt, times when life felt heavy, and times when we wondered if we were doing enough. But I had come to realize that those moments were part of the journey. The important thing was to keep moving forward, hand in hand, together. The next chapter of our life was waiting for us. It was unwritten, full of possibilities. And as long as we stayed committed to each other, no matter what came our way, I knew we could handle whatever the future held. Because we were no longer just surviving, we were living. And that made all the difference. It had been years since David and I had found our footing again, and now, as we approached a new milestone in our lives, I couldn't help but reflect on just how far we had come. Our children were nearly teenagers now, growing so fast, and the house had changed. The walls weren't just filled with the echoes of laughter from the past anymore. They were filled with the buzz of new dreams, new challenges, and the excitement of what's to come. David and I were in a good place, a place where we had learned to balance the demands of life while still nurturing the connection between us. I could see him more clearly now, the man who was both my partner and my best friend, the man who had once lost himself to escape, but now stood before me, fully present, grounded in the reality of his love for me and for our children. It felt like a miracle every day. But as we entered this new chapter, there were still hurdles. David's career had taken off, and while I was proud of him, I couldn't shake the old feeling that perhaps this success would take him away from us again. But then, instead of keeping those thoughts to myself, I shared them with him. I'm proud of you. I really am. But I just want to make sure we don't lose the balance we've worked so hard to find, I said one evening after the kids had gone to bed. He nodded, taking my hand in his. I know. I won't forget what's important. I promise. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the old tension, the worry that things might fall apart. I trusted him. He had earned that trust, and I had learned to trust myself again too. There came a time when we realized that our story wasn't just our own. It could be a light for others. David and I began volunteering at a local support group for people struggling with addiction and their families. It was strange at first, talking about our journey with others, but as we shared our experiences, we saw how much it resonated with others who were still in the thick of their struggles. We met parents who were facing the same fears I had once felt. We met children whose lives were altered by their parents' battles, much like our kids had been. And in every person we met, I saw pieces of our own story. But more importantly, I saw hope. Hope that, like us, they could find their way back from the darkness. David and I didn't have all the answers, but we had a lot to offer. Our story, our understanding, and most importantly, our willingness to stand by them as they navigated their own journeys. It was a humbling experience, one that made me appreciate how far we had come and reminded me that healing didn't end with us. It was a cycle, one that could continue to help others as it had helped us. The day came when our house, once filled with the bustle of children and the sound of their laughter, became quieter. Lily and Ethan were both off to college, pursuing their dreams. It was bittersweet. The house felt different, emptier in a way, but it was also a moment of pride. Our children had grown into wonderful young adults, ready to take on the world. David and I stood in the living room that day, just the two of us, looking around at the space that had once felt so chaotic. We had always joked that the house would feel too quiet once the kids left, but now that it was here, it felt like the next step. A chapter we had known would come, but hadn't quite been ready for. "What do we do now?" David asked, his voice tinged with humor. I smiled, taking his hand. "We do what we've always done. We grow together." And we did. We traveled more, enjoyed the quiet moments, and rediscovered parts of ourselves that had been waiting to be explored. But there was one thing that hadn't changed. The love we shared was still as strong as ever. And while we missed our children, we both knew they were exactly where they needed to be. It wasn't long after the kids left that I found myself standing in front of a mirror one day, reflecting on all that had transpired. Our story, once full of uncertainty and heartache, had transformed into something beautiful. It was a story of healing, of forgiveness, of second chances. David and I had come full circle, and while I had feared so much of the future in the past, I now realized that the future wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace. We had rebuilt our lives, one step at a time, learning the true meaning of love, resilience, and trust. We had become the kind of family we once dreamed of, a family that had been through the hardest of times and come out stronger on the other side. And now, with our children gone and a quiet house, we were ready to take on the next chapter. Whatever it would be, our journey had not been easy, and it was far from perfect, but it was ours, and I wouldn't trade it for anything.